Okay, so in this part I'm going to answer this fourth question and then wrap up the talk on the Redlands Affair. So the fourth question is, why did effective alliances fail to coalesce in support of certain permissive causes? The jailing and subsequent freeing of Jagger initially seemed to act as a catalyst for a campaign to reform the laws along the lines of other permissive legislation. Rees-Mogg found Jagger willing to act as an interlocutor between the counterculture and the establishment, and between the young and the old, leading to their memorable meeting on World in Action. Jagger flirted with Labour MP Tom Dryburgh's suggestion that he stand for Parliament, and appealed to liberal consciences by comparing the laws against drugs with those against homosexuality, when assuming the role of Oscar Wilde in the promotional film for the We Love You single. The Redlands Affair also prompted the hitherto oppositional counterculture to engage in pressure group activity. The Times ended its foot-dragging over publishing the Soma ad, and Soma's founder, Steve Abrams, found himself dealing directly with the medical and political sides of the establishment. That summer also spawned the drugs charity Release, after Caroline Coon and Rufus Harris met at a demonstration against the jailing of Jagger and Richards. Hippies staged a legalised pot rally in the most traditional of protest venues, Hyde Park, and Oz urged its readers to complain to the Press Commission about irresponsible newspaper coverage. Many of the conditions for permissive reform had therefore been met in reaction to the Redlands trial. Pressure groups became active, journalistic crusades were launched, and a dialogue was begun between establishment figures and articulate representatives of minority groups. Yet this alliance between liberals, the Stones, and the counterculture did not last, and this was due to the incompatible agendas and strategies of its constituent elements. Liberals were mollified by the appeals court ruling, which overturned Richards's conviction and commuted Jagger's to a suspended sentence. Their faith in the self-correcting nature of British justice had been restored, not that they'd been exactly alienated to begin with. It was significant that Rees-Mogg's celebrated editorial failed to defend Fraser, Richards or Schneiderman, and questioned only the severity of the sentence against Jagger, rather than the rectitude of the law per se. It was perhaps unreasonable to expect a libertarian stance from a Catholic moralist like Rees-Mogg, who lamented the rise in delinquency, drug-taking, suicide and promiscuity in his religious tracts. Further editorials that year accordingly denounced fallacious claims made in the Soma ad, stated that the Times is not in favour of legalising cannabis, and suggested that mind expansion was best left to religious mystics. Rees-Mogg's fundamentally paternalist approach accounted for his patronising metaphor of protecting that most ephemeral and defenceless of creatures, the butterfly. But Jagger was no butterfly. Still less was he one of nature's conservatives, as Rees-Mogg would later claim. His eye-catching discussions with establishment figures belied the manner in which the affair had compounded his alienation from state and society. Having experienced his nights in jail as the antithesis of permissiveness, he denounced Britain as a police state. He went further, depicting court proceedings as a game conducted by horrible grey people, politicians as grey-suited grafters, and hostile members of the public as simply mindless. While Rees-Mogg correctly saw Jagger as basing his arguments in the World in Action debate on those which had been used by John Stuart Mill in On Liberty, within a matter of weeks Jagger's libertarianism had evolved into a self-declared anarchism, according to which there should be no such thing as private property. The Stones, I think, were essentially too unrespectable, unrepresentative and uninterested to form a viable alliance with liberals, or for that matter, the counterculture. The band promo for We Love You demonstrated that the Stones still associated permissiveness with provocation. It depicted them parodying flower power, flirting with homosexuality and androgyny, and distinguishing between adversaries, you, and supporters, we. It also advanced a conspiracy theory in which the courts were in league with the press, the judge's wig being fashioned out of rolled-up newspapers, and paraded the Stones' drug use by showing Brian Jones in a thoroughly wasted state. Jagger's sanctification of Oscar Wilde overlooked how the latter's foolhardiness had pushed homosexuality underground for several decades. The same thing was to happen to drugs. The Stones' elitism and estrangement from society made them less interested in changing legislation than in gaining immunity from it. Jagger thought that the drugs laws were insufficiently important for him to campaign against, even if his efforts served to speed up the process of reform by perhaps 10 years. And the Stones, thereafter, seldom championed permissive causes, except when their own interests were threatened, as when the Beggar's Banquet cover was censored in 1968. Pressure group activity by the counterculture was equally problematic. Soma's claims to respectability were undermined by its most celebrated sponsors being the Beatles, one of whose members had recently confessed to taking acid, and whose manager, Brian Epstein, died of a drug overdose a month after signing the petition. Abrams and Kuhn confirmed their unrespectability later in 1967 by being arrested and fined for a breach of the peace, following the conviction of the hapless Brian Jones. Home Secretary James Callaghan's suggestion in 1969 that Soma had influenced the Wotton Committee was used to discredit the committee's eminently sensible report on cannabis. Yet Soma and release were still much too respectable for many in the counterculture, who treated the group's leaders with suspicion and disdain. Alternative countercultural strategies ranged from Mick Farron's fantasizing about stomping the first cop I meet to an all-too-literal interpretation of flower power in the form of a plan to inundate the Redlands trial magistrate with innumerable bouquets. The engagé and escapist wings of the underground fought over the affair in the pages of It, with a letter writer objecting that the accusatory headline reading "Your inactivity put the Stones inside" made the counterculture seem like any other bloody revolution. Oz's special issue on the Redlands trial epitomised the counterculture's confusion over tactics. In addition to endorsing the conventional pressure group activities of attending rallies and writing letters, it recommended vandalism of News of the World delivery vans and the yippie-style impudence of posting pot to your local clergyman, MP, or editor. Arrogance infected counterculturalist reactions to the Redlands Affair. They dismissed unwelcome poll data as so much propaganda and nonsense, labelled MPs as scum and farts, and claimed that the News of the World epitomises the money-grubbing, witch-hunting, God-playing fascism of a decaying hypocrisy. Yet such a Manichaean stance obscured the fact that the counterculture was morally compromised and unfit to govern itself. Scamming, freeloading, and petty pilfering were rife in the underground, and drugs destroyed several of its leading lights. The editor of its parish magazine, Tom McGrath, was a junkie, and the leader of its house band, Syd Barrett, an acid casualty. One founder of the World Psychedelic Centre, Michael Hollingshead, was living in some kind of hell of his own making, owing to methadone addiction, and another, Joey Mellon, bored a hole in his head in search of the ultimate high. The more thoughtful members of the counterculture, including McGrath, Jeff Nuttall, the Beatles, and Donovan, hoped that experimentation with drugs would exhaust itself, much as the state would wither away under Marxism. But in both cases, the opposite occurred. So, to conclude this fourth section, a coalition for reform of the drug laws was unsustainable in the 1960s because the aims and methods of its potential members were irreconcilable. Moreover, their very irreconcilability indicates that permissiveness wasn't a single cause, but rather a constellation of behaviours and beliefs championed by different interest groups and ideologies. The Stones interpreted permissiveness as a right to behave badly. The less confrontational members of the counterculture simply wished to govern themselves. The newspapers were fundamentally interested in furthering their own freedom of expression. The Times wished to challenge cases on appeal, while the News of the World wished to delve into celebrities' private lives, as indeed it did until very recently. Jagger's libel suit demonstrated how permissive causes could be not merely distinct, but also conflicting. His freedom to undertake consensual acts in private was pitted against journalists' freedom to expose illegality in a clash between two rival conceptions of permissiveness. And the loose connections between permissive reforms explain why the champions of one reform often opposed others. The Tory Norman St John Stevis stood for the liberalisation of censorship, but was against abortion. Labour's Leo Absey was equally opposed to abortion, while being instrumental in reforming the laws on divorce and male homosexuality. His Labour colleague, Kenneth Robinson, advocated the decriminalisation of abortion and male homosexuality, but campaigned to tighten the law on amphetamines. And the Conservative Ronald Bell voted to abolish the death penalty and was one of the very few MPs to object to the drugs laws. But he was, in other respects, a fully paid-up member of the Monday Club.